All right, we're going to talk about Barry the batsman. Barry's a cricketer, and over the score of a season, we've recorded his innings, his runs, how many times he scored every time he batted. He batted 20 times, and I can work out the mean. Now, this little symbol X with a little bar over the top of it is the symbol we use for mean, or you might remember the mean is the same thing as the average. So, what was his average score over a season? Well, we can take his scores, and we're going to use this little formula. Now, this looks a bit scary, but it's not that bad. It's a symbol I want to introduce you to, and it's like this big back to front kind of E kind of thing like this. This is the Greek letter sigma, and all it means is the sum of. It means you add up all of the X values. So for the average, hopefully you can remember from previous work, you just add up all the scores and you divide by the number of scores. Well, that's what we've got here. The sum of all the scores divided by the number of scores. So when I add all his scores together, they come up to 376 for the 20 different times he's batted. So I'm going to do 376 divided by 20 to get an average of 18.8. That's Barry's average for the season. There's a couple of other things that we'll want to talk about that we can take from this data. One of them is the range. And the range is just an idea of how far apart the spread of the scores are from the maximum to the minimum. So I take the maximum score, in this case, after listing all the scores in order. You can see I've rewritten his scores from the lowest to highest, which allows me to see the maximum was 39, the minimum was 2, so the range was the distance between those. In other words, his range of scores was 37. The mode is the most. Maybe you can remember it like that. Mode is most. Most frequent. The score that occurs the most. This also helps that I've put them in order because I can see by looking through that 11 occurs 3 times. There's a few other things that occur twice, but the one score that pops up more than that is 11. That is the mode. The most frequent score in this case is 11. If there are 2 scores that are the most frequent, like they're both the same, then we say they're both the mode. What else do we want to know? The median. The median is just the score in the middle. So now that I've listed them in order, it helps me to be able to find the one in the middle. Now, if there's 20 scores, the median is going to be between the 10th and the 11th. There isn't going to be one single number that represents our median because I've got an even number either side of the middle. So if I come up 10 scores and I want to take the score that's here between those two. So in other words, what's the score that sits between 18 and 19? Because I've got 10 on either side of that gap. Right. If there was a number on its own in the middle, so in other words, if I had an odd number of scores, it would just be that middle score. But I don't in this case. So all I do is I take the number that's halfway between them. Or in other words, I add them together and divide by 2 to get a median, in this case, of 18.5. Barry's scores, if I was to graph them out over a season, would look something like this. Now, that's a lot of bars, and, if we were dealing with maybe 100 different numbers, it gets to a point where your graph is going to be not very useful or too cluttered. So we can do what we call grouping the data or creating grouped data. So in this case, instead of 20 different columns, I just want 4 columns on my graph. So I'm going to create classes. In other words, groups of scores, and every time there's a score within that group, it counts as 1 towards the frequency for that group. So in this case, I'm going to group my scores from 0 to 9, 10 to 19, 20 to 29, 30 to 39. Now you'll see, very importantly, there's no overlap. So it's very clear which class a score belongs in. So I didn't do 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30. Because what would I do with a score of 10? Would it fit in this box or would it fit in this box? So very clearly that they don't overlap. They're all equally large. So in other words, if I look at this first class, 0 to 9, and list them out, I can see that there are 10 scores. Every group has 10 scores in it. So everything's the same size. The next thing I want to work out is this thing called the class center. In other words, what's the score that's right in the middle of that class? Well, here's my 0 to 9. And just like we did with the median, I can work out the median or the middle score of that group is 4.5. So I would say the class center for that group is 4.5. So what that means is effectively every score in that group, we just treat it as if it's 4.5. Now, it might be a 1, or it might be a 9, or it might be a 0. For the purposes of group data, we just assume that everything in there is a 4.5. I'm going to do the same with the next group, and I can see that halfway between those is 14.5, and hopefully you can see the pattern. It's going up there by 10 every time. The next column is the frequency. The frequency is just how often something occurs. So in other words, how many scores sit within this class. Well, let's have a look. From 0 to 9, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 scores. So there's a frequency of 4. So effectively what that means, like I said, is it means that basically every one of those scores now just becomes a 4.5. We treat it as if it's 4.5. Let's look at the next class, 10 to 19. That covers this distance here, and I can see that there are 7 scores in there. Effectively, they all become 14.5 each because that was our class center. And I can do the same now with the next class and finally with the last class. Last column, what is this fx column? Well, this means f times x. Now, because I've got an f column for my frequency, we've labeled that f. My class center, I label x. So traditionally we call the class center the x column. The frequency is f. So f times x just multiplies these two columns together. So in this case, oh, sorry, I forgot before we go on. If I add up all of my frequencies, I get 20, which makes sense because there were 20 scores. And we're going to label this one the sum of f. Remember we said this little back to front symbol here, which we call the sigma, stands the sum of. So if I add up all of the numbers in my f column, I get 20. Going back to what I said, if I multiply fx, so this times this, I get 18. This times this, I get 101.5, etc., etc. And I'm going to add them up as well. In other words, I'm going to do the sum of fx column. The reason I do that is I'm going to use these two numbers because the average for grouped data, so to work out the average for grouped data, we do the sum of the fx column over the sum of the f column. In other words, I add up all of these and divide them by all of these. In this case, 390 divided by 20 gets me 19.5. So that is how we do the average of grouped data.